two basic questions. Are vaccines safe? If so, what is the proof? Are vaccines effective? If so, what is the proof? I am not talking about all vaccines, though this applies to all vaccines specifically on what we're dealing with. I was surprised when I realized it had not. When I began to review what amounted to thousands of peer-reviewed literature studies on vaccines, I found that I could find no convincing evidence that any vaccine at all had long-term, double-blind, placebo-controlled study trials. And even when they said, when the evidence I did examine, that the CDC and the FDA and other organizations were using as, oh, of course they're studies, and they showed the studies, they would say, well, this is a study, and then I would find that, well, you left out the virus part of the vaccine, but you included all the other ingredients, including thimerosal and mercury and formaldehyde, etc. Well, that's not a placebo. And in good science, you don't use that as a placebo. For 18 years, sir, I have been trying to help the Gulf War veterans in the United States do something that I'm appalled to say that our own federal agencies has failed to do, including Bush Sr., Clinton, and Bush Jr. administrations. Acknowledge that 400,000 GIs who are sick with Gulf War syndrome actually have something other than post-traumatic stress disorder. I've done 3 award-winning documentaries on the plight. I've interviewed over 1,000 of them. I've interviewed people who have massive body lesions, who have rare and exotic diseases, who have brain and neurological disorders, having nothing to do with post-traumatic, didn't even go to the Gulf Theater. They got the vaccines, the experimental anthrax vaccine, the experimental botulism vaccine, that the FDA, similar to what it's doing with swine flu, gave a pass, an exemption on long-term studies. Those Americans, those brave, courageous Americans, over 33,000 are reported dead. Their statistics appear nowhere, only by those who are Gulf War veterans putting together their own figures. They have gone to Washington. I've gone to Washington to interview Chris Lott. I've gone to Washington to interview the people in the presence of the Gulf War vet, a man who got out of bed in the morning, had to crawl to get to his daughter because his legs were swollen the size of a football. A woman who had no illnesses, 22 years old, was in the Gulf vet, got the vaccines, and now couldn't walk in bed 16, 18 hours a day. The government has refused to acknowledge that Gulf War syndrome is legitimate. To this day, now I've read the hearings, and I saw all of those white coat phenomena, the scientists and physicians that we bow down to, marching in and giving testimony. I have every word they said at every committee hearing. Rockefeller Committee, all of them. And they all were in gross denial. Whose interests were they serving? Certainly not the sick Gulf vets. And you would see the Gulf vets determined to get their story out. No one listening. No one has looked at the facts yet. There are 44 separate studies, 44 today, that show that Gulf War syndrome is real and that it was due to what they were exposed to. These are real diseases. For a decade and more, they said there's no diseases. Now I'm wanting to ask, you're willing to inject pregnant women in this state or fire them if they don't take the vaccine? Are you or any member here, anyone, is the governor, is anyone in the state going to be held personally and legally responsible if that developing fetus gets that mercury into their brain and ends up with a learning disability, with autism, with any one of the autism spectrum disorders, or ends up with some form of intellectual deficit? We have an epidemic. I did another award-winning documentary called The Drugging of Our Children. Appalling to know that when you were going to school, when I was going to school, no kid got drugged. Today, 10 million American children don't go to school before they get a class 2 drug, the same class as cocaine. Do we actually have a new epidemic that didn't happen to any generation in American history, anywhere else in the world, but suddenly happened in the last 25 years to the newest generation? They have a brain chemical imbalance? No. And yet the so-called experts, the very experts that you would rely upon, are saying, well, there must be something wrong, that's why we're giving them the drugs must work. And I say, no. The number 1 cause of death in the United States in 10 to 14-year-old boys is suicide. How many kids committed suicide when you were going to school, sir? None when I went to school, and I went to the largest high school in my state, 5,500 students, Park Creek High School. So what do we have? A whole new generation of people where autism is suddenly showing its head but never before? If autism were historically there, then everyone in their 50s, 60s, and 70s would start representing at least percentage-wise population autism in adults. We don't see it. It doesn't exist. And yet we refuse to acknowledge that what they're getting early in life could be contributing to it. So I'm saying I'm not willing to sit by quietly and allow women who've been used and abused by the medical authorities, the very same medical doctors who have sit here with great certainty and enormous hubris and contempt for women, say, your body is our concern, your developing fetus is in our best interest to make sure it's born healthy, and yet give them mercury. You ask that same doctor, would you give that woman lead? Would you give anyone in this room lead? If you did, you would go to jail. So you're going to give something more toxic than lead to every one of these pregnant women? Sir, I'm appalled and I'm offended in the extreme, and I will not contain my concern, because these same women that we're so-called interested in, for the last 35 years, I've been one of the leading people advocating against synthetic hormone replacement therapy. We know now it causes breast cancer, ovarian cancer, heart attacks, dementia, and stroke. 10% minimum, 13% more likely. You're talking about 10 million women. That's 1.3 million women we're allowing to be sacrificed on the altar of ignorance or greed or hubris. By the new definition, the world will always be in a pandemic requiring flu vaccines. This is not what the World Health Organization recently announced. Now, the efficacy. Dr. Anthony Morris, who should have been here, the former chief vaccine officer, top authority at the FDA, quote, the producers of these vaccines know they are worthless, but they go on selling them anyway. CDC officials have confessed, quote, influenza vaccines are the least effective immunizing agents available, especially for the elderly and the children. So when I was in Albany last week, this is in full view of the public. I'm concerned that we do not allow people in our society a freedom of choice. Democracy is about freedom of choice. You can believe any religion is the right one, any job you want, any political party. Well, why can't you have the same right of choice about your body and your health? I am a healthy American, and I do not want, as a healthy American, a toxic drug in my body. To me, that's a violation of my constitutional rights, as well as just decency and ethics. Thank you very much.